Welcome to the latest in Farrar's Buildings series of webinars. This one on the fairly hot topic of e-scooter liability. I'm just been waiting there for the number of participants to level off. I think the additions are slowing down now. So I think we're probably good to start. My name's James Pretsell. And I will be speaking on this topic with my co-presenter, James Plant. There's some nonsense people have said about me, which is pretty much untrue, I think. And there's the stuff that people have very generously and truthfully said about James Plant. You will receive automatically copies, an email copy of a link to the recording and also these slides, so that you can print out, obviously, James Plant's image and have it in your bedroom wall, whatever else you'd like to do with it, and throw darts at mine, perhaps. The agenda, well, fairly simple. James is introducing it, and then there are two sections in which James speaks about various things to do with e-scooter liability, and then questions and answered by James and James. So there's a Q&A function on Zoom that should appear on the taskbar. Please, any queries, put them in there. I will then, when James Plant is speaking, I'll monitor those and see if there's anything in there that you're interested in us answering, and we'll come back to that at the end of the talk. In broad terms, what we'd like to achieve today is to give you some insight into the statistics around rental and usage of e-scooters, some insight into what sort of patterns and statistics there are relating to injury as a consequence of e-scooters. And then, so that's more of a general background, which actually is fairly interesting, and I think useful to give us all a bit of an insight into where issues relating to e-scooters are going to be going. And then we're going to move into the law. Obviously, these are new types of machinery and technology, relatively speaking, certainly in terms of how they're being legislated for. So that there are going to be some interesting points about certainly insurance coverage and liability issues. So I'm going to deal with the first half, and in terms of general data, there's an interesting survey and research project which was carried out back in January of 2021, and it was carried out by a third-party research agency, and it was on the instruction of government. And it was to look into ownership, rental and usage of e-scooters. And this was all part of the background to the government's rolling out of statutorily approved rental schemes, which we shall touch on later. And some interesting statistics emerged from that poll. Of the respondents to the poll, only 7% had actually ever used an e-scooter, and interestingly, of that number, 72% of those who had used them purely did so for fun, rather than having any specific travel purpose. Only 25% of respondents said that they were using them primarily as a means of transport, whether that's commuting from a station over Waterloo Bridge or whatever else it may be. So the government's aim has been consistently that e-scooters should be a very convenient and relatively climate-friendly mode of transport, especially in city environments. But the stats don't really back that up in terms of the responses. Only 10% of respondents said that they would buy an e-scooter, and 15% said that they would rent. So again, relatively low numbers, interestingly, in terms of those who were polled. When it comes to, and I think this is where we start to touch on issues of interest to personal injury lawyers, 39% of respondents said that they would use an e-scooter rather than walk. So what we have there is an interesting statistic in that, in two senses really. Firstly, we have, rather than walking, people actually using e-scooters. So the health drive possibly is not being well met by that. But more to the point, we have a large tranche of pedestrians who may become road users, because that's what you are when you start using an e-scooter. And you are, it would seem, at far greater risk and more vulnerable as an e-scooter rider than you are as a pedestrian. So safety issues and accidents generally may be on the increase as a consequence of people migrating from a pedestrian mode to a road user mode. Again, interestingly, final point from that poll, 53% of people polled considered that safety of e-scooters was an overriding disadvantage. So there is a perception that e-scooters lack the requisite safety, and we'll come to that momentarily. We also have some data collated by the Department of Transport. We will see in 2021, top headline figure there under the bullet point, we have, compared to the previous year, triple the number of collisions involving e-scooters, 1,352 up from 460. We have triple the number of casualties, and we have a tenfold increase in fatalities. So between 2020 and 2021, we see a bit of a step change in e-scooter use, collisions, and fatalities. And that largely, it seems, would have comes off the back of the introduction of statutory approved schemes in various cities for the use of rental scooters. We have statistics also from 2022. Broadly speaking, we have collisions, casualties, and fatalities at a similar level to the year before. So it seems that potentially we have some sort of plateauing between 2021 and 2022 of the number and types of collisions that are occurring. It might be that the statutory approved schemes had essentially reached their optimum level, and so that big step change jump we saw in 2021 has leveled off. Here we have a further bit of data from that study for the year ending June 2022. And what we can see here is, well, we have the e-scooter users. These are the number of reported casualties in collisions for the year ending June 2022. We have over 1,000 reported casualties, serious casualties, 347, and fatalities, 11. Importantly, and by really quite a margin, the next high, that group of road user who's been affected by collisions are pedestrians. So it seems that we have a number of conflicts between e-scooter users and pedestrians, and also to a lesser extent with pedal cyclists, and to a much lower extent with motorcyclists. Other road users tend to be very well protected from any collision with an e-scooter, so they are relatively low on the scale of things. And here we have a chart really showing probably what I've alluded to already in terms of a plateauing. And you'll see the very considerable rise in casualties and collisions between January of 2020 and June 2021. There's a bit of an anomalous drop then down into January 2022, with an uptick for June 2022. Not quite clear why that's happened, but just taking a broad brush look at it, one can see where we are in June 2022 is broadly similar to June 2021. So it does seem as though we're seeing potentially a levelling off in terms of casualties in collisions with e-scooters. As I say, I suspect that as at June 21 through to June 22 and onwards, the number of statutorily approved schemes for rental of e-scooters has plateaued, and so the number of users has plateaued also, with a corresponding plateauing with numbers of collisions. So who is having the collisions? Well, if you take anything away from today's talk, it won't be much of a surprise that, well, these men are idiots, aren't they? I mean, that's really what this proves. It's quite striking how many more men are injured. What's not clear, to be fair to men, for once, I think, is that what the respective use by gender of e-scooters is it that e-scooters are actually used far more often by men than by women? So men might be let a little bit off the hook for their involvements in these collisions. But you'll see by and large, it is young men who are, by really quite a margin, the most likely to be casualties in e-scooter incidents. And actually men consistently, all the way up through all age groups, are by considerable factors much more likely to be injured. This next chart, I don't know how good your screens are and what font you're able to, what size font you're able to view this. As I say, this is coming, these slides are coming to you automatically in any event, so you'll be able to have a proper look at them. It's an important table. It deals with fatalities involving collisions with e-scooters. And what we can draw from this is that where there are fatalities, the casualty is overwhelmingly a male, overwhelmingly a young male, and overwhelmingly they are involved in collisions with vehicles. And the casualty, the deceased, is almost invariably the e-scooter rider. I think there's one instance or two instances of someone other than the rider being injured. I think in one instance a pedestrian, and then in another instance it's simply just that person's described simply as other road user. Also importantly, where the cause of death is known, it is almost always a head injury. That is the underlying cause of the fatality. So we're getting some sort of insight now into the categories of individual and types of injuries which are going to give rise to the most significant personal injury claims. A couple of videos for you to view at your leisure. These are dash cam footage, both of them, I think, of incidents involving e-scooter riders. I mean, probably one thing you can take away from this when you view it is that the Daily Mail headline is unsurprisingly somewhat lurid and overstates things. In fact, from a personal injury lawyer perspective, you view them and they look like fairly benign incidents. But what we do see are e-scooters being used in both of those clips in pretty daft ways, and the e-scooter user coming into potential conflict with other vehicles. So it's worth an insight just to see what sort of incidents we're going to be dealing with. Patterns of injury. There's been an interesting research article published in the British Medical Journal, which looks into the patterns of injury that are most commonly found in incidents involving e-scooters. And most commonly injured, we have head, upper extremities, lower extremities. Similar types of injuries to skateboards and non-motorized scooters, but what has been found is they're often much more severe due to the increased speed of the e-scooters. And we also have in e-scooter claims or incidents, I should say, that it's the fall rather than the collision that's often the leading cause. So rather than being struck by the vehicle, it's often the fall from the e-scooter, perhaps the e-scooter rider taking avoiding action, which will result in a fall onto the outstretched hand. So quite often there are unpleasant hand injuries. Equally, a lot of ankle injuries, which is perhaps explicable because in a tricky situation, you'll jump off your scooter and twist your ankle or break it. And there are also very low rates of helmet use involved in e-scooters, much lower it seems than with pedal cycles. There's a suggestion that the high prevalence of head injuries may well be down to that low rate of use. That seems fairly straightforward. But there are interesting other studies suggest that those injuries may well be preventable in the same way that injuries caused by pedal cycles may be prevented by wearing a helmet. So that's a bit of a quick tour through various bits of data which provide detail to the background of where we're going to go with in the future, really, with these types of claim. Now, the law itself, well, e-scooters, the law, the road traffic law applies to e-scooters as it does to any other type of vehicle. And there are a few points that are important to understand. It is perfectly legal to sell, buy and own an e-scooter and of course to ride it on private land. But almost without exception, e-scooters are powered transporters. That's what they are classed as, and they will need to satisfy the various requirements of the Road Traffic Act in order to use public roads lawfully. So it isn't legal to ride them on the road or the pavement, and it isn't legal to ride them without tax, insurance, or indeed a license. So there are exceptions which we'll come to, but very often if you see somebody riding on the public highway with an e-scooter, they are acting in breach of the various mandatory requirements of the Road Traffic Act 1988. And the pavement, you'll note from the Highways Act 1835, which section 72, combined with section 34 of the Road Traffic Act, bans mechanically propelled vehicles from footpaths, bridleways or restricted byways. And there is, under section 72, a penalty for anyone committing that nuisance by riding on a footpath. So just make sure that in future you don't do that, or you don't lead or drive any of your horses, asses, sheep, mules, swines or cattle or carriage of any description. It's still in force, this, on the footpath. And it goes on. We've got all sorts of interesting stuff here, but interestingly, you can't allow any timber, stone, hay, straw, dung, manure, lime, soil, ashes, rubbish, or other matter or thing whatsoever upon such highway. So we've got quite an interesting little insight into how the law stood back in 1835, and that back then people were very worried about squibs, rockets, and serpents rather than anything else. We're worried about e-scooters, and e-scooters have in fact been subject to some cases. The references are there for you to consider at your own leisure. The first case is worth a quick read, just because Mr. Saddington sounds like a bit of a character. He was apprehended in Harrogate on his GoPed, which was a scooter. It had I think a 25cc engine on it. which he was riding around Harrogate. He undertook a police car, drove through a red light. The policeman chased him. Mr. Saddington escaped through a gap, I think, between vehicles, picked up his go-ped and ran into a pub where he hid. Interestingly, that Mr. Saddington sought sanctuary in a pub because at the time he was banned from driving and was disqualified. His license had been disqualified. So perhaps a little insight into Mr. Saddington's private life there. But importantly for our purposes, it was found that the go-ped was a scooter. It was powered by an internal combustion engine. And although it wasn't something that you'd ordinarily wanted to go out on the road in, it had sufficient characteristics that it would be expected to be used on the road, and as a consequence, the provisions of the Road Traffic Act applied to it. So Mr. Saddington had to have a driving licence and third-party insurance when he used it on the road, and he had neither. Winter and DPP, this is a Citybug electric scooter. The argument there was that the Citybug had a pair of minuscule pedals attached to the front wheel. And it was argued that that brought it within the definition of an electrically propelled bicycle, which you could use on the road without a license or insurance, rather than it being a vehicle which fell within the statutory framework set out by the Road Traffic Act. I think there was quite a zealous policeman based in Soho who was pursuing various people who were riding these Citybugs around. Anyway, in Winter and DPP, he got his day in court, and the High Court agreed with him that the Citybug electric scooter was not an electrically powered bicycle, because the wheels at the front, the pedals at the front were so small that they couldn't realistically propel the vehicle. So it fell out with the provisions and was a motorised vehicle. And Coats and Crown Prosecution Service, segways, well, there we are. Segway, I think it's probably relatively obvious, but it was analogous to a carriage. And so again, that a Segway falls within that framework. So those are three cases that are useful if there are ever arguments about the status of an e-scooter as being an e-scooter. Insurance, well, it's probably a point that we're all rather interested in at the moment. I think probably it's something to keep an eye on, rather than there being specific insurance provisions available at the moment. One can obtain specific e-scooter policies, but those are very specifically to cover for use on private land with the landowner's permission only. So they don't have any application to the public highway. Possibly coverage under home insurance policies. Lots of home insurance policies have different types of wording. Query though that actually the requirement for to insure an e-scooter is a requirement to insure under the Road Traffic Act. So I'm not entirely sure that people will be able to rely on the provisions of home insurance when in fact a road traffic policy would be what is required. Arguably the MIB, but might be involved. But of course, they're no longer required to cover for accidents on private land once that case of Vanook, which I assume you have a bit of an understanding of. I probably don't have time to go into Vanook now, but do have a look at that as it deals with the liability of the MIB to cover accidents on private land where there is no insurance coverage. As I say, that's now been removed by specifically by the statutory provision that I set out there. There is their statutory exception, and those are these rental schemes. And I'm sure you've probably all come across these in pretty much every major city that you go to, and even larger towns. There are often rental e-scooter schemes You'll often see them at the railway stations and dotted around the towns and city centres. There are two requirements that continue to apply to these. You do need, firstly, you need a valid driving licence in order to operate one. And anyone who's tried to sign up for these things, you have to often you download your driving licence, an image of your driving licence, which is then checked. And there also has to be in place a motor vehicle insurance policy. Now, that motor vehicle insurance policy I'll come into that in a second, but these types of schemes are statutory approved. They've been extended to May 2024, when it's mooted that there's going to be specific legislation relating to formalising these schemes. Just one query on that, which is probably worth considering, just to keep an eye on. I know that the police are very concerned about the use of e-scooters. There are a certain type of e-scooter which is used frequently with those sort of rather unpleasant, sort of bash and grab type muggings, and they are they're used as getaway vehicles, and they can get up to considerable speed, and it'll be interesting to see quite what consultation with the police occurs, and what their view is about extending these schemes and how they're actually going to be controlled. On the insurance points, these schemes have to have compulsory insurance arranged by the provider. So, for example, we have an example there, Lime, who are one of the major statutory scheme providers. There's an alliance policy with them, unlimited liability for personal injury. So if you use their e-scooters and you run someone down, you benefit from an unlimited liability coverage in terms of your indemnity, and up to 5 million for property damage. But it is only third-party cover, so it is relatively limited. So that's where we are, the law as it is, and data and stats as they are. What James is now going to do is move us on to what's going to happen, well, in terms of litigation, and also what's likely to happen in the future.
Thanks, James. So hopefully that's just moved that slide on. There's quite a lot of information in my slides, as well as the information that we've seen in James's. I'm going to skip over some, as James said. They are being sent over afterwards. You can view them at your leisure. The first issue I'm going to look at is where we're going next, after hearing from James about where we are, why and how we got here. In terms of where we're going, the genie is very much out of the bottle, and it's difficult to see anything other than legislation and regulation taking the use of e-scooters onto the next stage. And the reason for that is practical. There are large-scale schemes, rental schemes, that James has spoken about. They bring employment to numerous urban areas. They've been running for several years. I've checked, and they're currently in the process of retendering now for 2024 onwards. There's an industry in selling, reselling, repairing, modifying e-scooters. That's expanding both online and on the high street. There's widespread personal ownership, as you can see walking down most high streets, dodging these smaller e-scooters. The environmental benefits, or perceived environmental benefits, that James mentioned. The government has at least announced, before swiftly rolling back on, the intention to create a new class of motor vehicles. And surely the government's got one eye as well on other forms of transport that are being developed. I think what all stakeholders agree, and I refer in a couple of slides on to a meeting between insurers, claimant representatives, the police, manufacturers. I think everyone was in agreement that regulation, i.e. about how scooters are constructed and how they're used, and compulsory insurance is going to be required to protect innocent road and footpath users from being injured, and to provide them with compensation when they are. Just skipping on through the next ones, as I say, you'll receive these afterwards. So just before we get to civil claims, there's just one thing I wanted to touch on particularly, as it's been recently updated. Now, there was an inquest at the back end of last year into the sad death of Miss Fatima Abuka, and as you'll see there, she was a young person, only 14 years old. She's riding an e-scooter, and she was sadly killed. She's riding with no helmet, on and off the pavement into the road, where she was hit by and dragged under a minibus. Now, at the inquest, or rather after the inquest, the coroner made a prevent further death report, and that was then sent out to numerous relevant people, the Met, TfL, Secretary of State's for Transport, and for the Home Office, and retailers both online and bricks and mortar, addressing various points. Now, the 3 points that concerned the coroner were these. Firstly, that when the police, the Met, reduced enforcement, there appeared to be an increase in deaths. Now, responses have just been made public in the past few weeks, I think. And interestingly, the Met deny this correlation, and indeed say that no such evidence was heard at the inquest. So that's no doubt an ongoing issue. That there's a lack of requirement for people wearing only rental schemes, and indeed personal owners as well, to wear helmets. And there's quite clearly a correlation, as we've seen in the data that James provided, between this lack of wearing helmets and serious head injury, in this case obviously a death, and that warnings have been inconsistent, or they've not been provided at the point of sale. There's not a huge amount, as you'd expect from various bodies who are open to potential criticism from a coroner's PFD. There's not a huge amount that's groundbreaking in their responses. If anyone's interested, do get in contact. I can send them on. Two things that I did note. Firstly, the Met are making noises about enforcing the use of e-scooters more vigorously. And if that's happening, particularly with younger users of them, that's something that may come into play in respect of civil claims. And also the DVSA has been for about a year now undertaking market surveillance on retailers and checking if they're doing what they should be in respect of legal notices. So just moving on to what's likely to come up in respect of civil claims. The number one issue, the sort of red flag that's walked in front of the e-scooter claim, is the argument of ex Turpi Causa. So can you defend the claim on the basis of the claimant e-scooter users' illegality? And by that I mean, are they using a privately owned scooter on a carriageway or footway, or are they using a rental scooter where they shouldn't be, like a footway, for example? Now, the leading case is Pretsell and Mirza, Supreme Court case, also not linked to personal injury. It's an unjust enrichment case arising out of a share deal. Now, what that established, pulling together the authorities in the years leading up to it, that illegality is far from an absolute bar to a claim. A three-stage test is set out, which, as I say, is consistent with the authority leading up to it. That firstly, the court has to look at what is the purpose of the law that's broken. Now, in the context of an e-scooter claim, that arguably weighs more heavily against the rider of, say, any e-scooter riding on the pavement than it might weigh against someone who's on a privately owned scooter scooting on the road. But for reasons that I'll touch on, that might be irrelevant in any event in terms of a major consideration for the court in terms of ex turpi. Secondly, what public policy would be undermined by allowing the defence and denying the claim? And then finally, is it proportionate, or is it in fact overkill to deny the claim for the reason of ex turpi? In the context of a motor case, we can see it in the case of McCracken against Smith. Now, not an e-scooter case. It's pre the case of Pretsell, but entirely compliant with the reasoning that's in it. Now, in that case, the claimant's a pillion passenger on a motorbike, and that motorbike is hit by a negligently driven minibus. But the issue, one of the main issues in this case, was that it wasn't just any motorbike. It's a trial bike. It's not road legal. It's not suitable for carrying a pillion passenger. The rider had no license or insurance, and that was something that the claimant pillion passenger was aware of. He was 16, he had no helmet, the bike was stolen, it was being ridden fast and dangerously and improperly on a cycle path. Now, what is of note, that despite that veritable cornucopia of illegalities, it still wasn't sufficient to bar the claim for ex turpi. What it was sufficient for is a very heavy finding of contrib, and that was, as you can see on the slide, 65% against the claimant, 50% for his conduct, and 15% for not wearing a helmet, and that's assessed on Freeman Butcher principles. Now, anyone who's following the e-scooter cases got excited when we saw that there was a case going through the Central London County Court, Drago, and London Borough of Barnet. It's been reported extensively, mostly in the newspapers, just because of the nature of the claim. And that's a lady who's on her own scooter. She fell off due to a pothole. So it's a claim brought under Section 41 of the Highways Act. Defendant argued, amongst other things, ex turpi. And I've spoken to claimant's counsel, and my understanding is that issue was fully argued out before the court. Judgment came last month. And obviously it was eagerly anticipated. You don't have to look very far in the legal blogs and reports online to see that everyone had their eye on it. A bit of a damp squib, sadly. Claim was dismissed for the failure to prove that her accident was caused by an actionable defect. So rather a classic occurrence in a Section 41 claim. So did she prove that the pothole did you prove the pothole caused the accident, or did she prove the existence in that pothole of an actionable defect at the material time? And despite the argument surrounding ex turpi, no mention, as I understand it, I've not actually got my hands on the judgment, but there's no mention even in obiter about ex turpi. Now, I'm going to stick my neck out and say, given the facts of McCracken, and given that the issues typically arising in an e-scooter on the carriageway, even on the pavement case, seem to be less worthy of criticism than the claimant in McCracken, it's my view that unless they're very narrow facts that take it even further than the case of McCracken and Smith, I would suspect that ex turpi is not going to get very far. But I suppose I have to put the caveat on to watch this space, because I'm sure the argument will come back again before the court. Just touching on a couple of other issues that arise or may arise in e-scooter cases before we move on to questions. Causation, first of all. Now, the illegal usage of an e-scooter doesn't just go to ex turpi. It can speak to liability itself if, for example, the illegal usage falls outside the normal range of hazards that one would expect another road user, car, van driver, lorry driver, etc., would be expected to guard against. Now, arguably, that's more about conduct of the rider per se rather than illegality itself, but they're likely to commingle. But certainly the illegally ridden e-scooter can find themselves in difficulties if it's a situation where, as I say, the other road user is dealing with something that's not in the normal range of things that I'd expect to deal with and anticipate. One other point that I mentioned, it rather cuts both ways for scooter users, is that the relatively new provisions in the Highway Code warn road users about vulnerable road users, and also there's a hierarchy of road users. And of course, someone on an e-scooter finds himself at the more vulnerable end of that hierarchy, but certainly pedestrians, arguably people and horses, some scooters and push bikes are going to be more vulnerable than someone on a e-scooter that's propelled and indeed heavier and can be propelled at high or higher speeds. One thing that I've set out is just some tips if you're bringing or defending a lot of e-scooter claims. It's worth forming a database of hire T's and C's from the hire companies. They're not a huge amount of them. They do change periodically. It's worth just having a rolling database of that for as and when the claims come about. It shouldn't take too much in terms of resources to do that. And similarly, there are a limited amount of manufacturers and retailers, and again, they have website material that is dated and changing and evolving. So it's worth building that up as time progresses. We've mentioned Contrib. Clearly, there are a couple of points to pick up in respect of that. When one is looking at contributory negligence, it's not just blameworthiness, but also causative potency that the court has to consider. So really, that's not just the fault, of course, but the causative effect of that fault as well. Now, a useful case to illustrate that is Jackson and Murray. If nothing else, it rather shows that judges struggle to assess contrib, and certainly to do it consistently. In that case, the claimant is a 13-year-old. She crosses the road from behind her school minibus. The driver's doing 50 miles an hour in a 60. And at first instance, there was a finding of fact, and it wasn't appealed, that the defendant should, in the circumstances that he was presented with, should have appreciated the risk of a child crossing behind that minibus and should have slowed down to 30 to 40 miles an hour. Now, at first instance, the finding of contrib was 90%. So on primary liability, 90% contrib. It was reduced on appeal to 70. And then when it got to the Supreme Court, it was reduced again, 50-50. And even that was a 3-2 split. So who'd be a judge and who'd assess Contributory with any degree of confidence with those kind of statistics? Plainly, as I've said before, a scooter has a lower causative potency when ranged against a car, probably motorcycle, and vehicles that are bigger and have poorer sight lines than those. A word about helmets, possibly also, and this, I'm not aware of any case law about it, possibly other protective gear like elbow pads or knee pads. I think in Drago, for example, claimant had a helmet, but she didn't have any knee protection and sustained a serious knee injury. In cases we're talking about PPE like helmets or talking about seat belts, it's assessed on seat belts, Freeman Butcher principles, 25% contrib if the injuries would have been avoided, 15 if there's a considerable difference, and not if none. One more point I pick up here is about age. Now, I've mentioned the case of Fatima Abukar. She was 14. Now, clearly we're going into an age where younger road users will be on the road using powered vehicles. Now, be they doing that legally or illegally, road users are going to have to be aware of that happening and take greater care because of it. And it may be that we see in e-scooter cases some of the issues that were in the case of Ellis and Kelly arising. In that, it's not an e-scooter case, or indeed a vehicle case, a pedestrian running down case. An 8-year-old who was at a playground, they were crossing near but not at a pedestrian crossing. Now, they were unsupervised. What they did have, and this is something that the child had done for some time, was have a mobile phone, was playing at a playground near home, and would get in contact with mum if they needed to, and regularly cross the road with no incident, both prior to the day in question and also numerous times on the day. I think there was a skate park or something on the other side of the road. Now, in that case, the defendant alleged contrib, producing a case where an 8-year-old had been found to be contributory negligent in a road crossing case, and also brought a contribution claim against mum as well. Both of those failed. So against the claimant on the facts, and in respect of mum, more as a policy decision as much as anything else, noting that it fixes parents with too high a standard of care. There's a lack of insurance for parents, the risk of overcautious parenting, and then there's obviously a potential conflict of interest in that a parent would be the most likely and obvious choice to be the litigation friend in the claim brought against the negligent driver. And as I say, I would not be surprised to see those, particularly if you have 14-year-olds or younger, being bought, because they can only be bought by people over the age of, I think it's 18. But if they're been bought them and they're being allowed to use them, then I would not be surprised to see someone running a claim against a parent or someone in loco parentis, or a contribution claim, I should say. So just a couple of points that I think are likely or may well rear their ugly heads in the coming years. Pothole claims, obviously, case of Drago. One wonders, with the predominance and prevalence of e-scooters alongside a greater use of mobility-based vehicles for those who are less able, so smaller wheels, they don't have as competent suspension. Is that likely to lead to a change in certain areas about what is deemed dangerous for the purpose of Section 41 of the Highways Act, i.e. in a busy urban area, is a road surface that was tolerated 5 years ago and claims were dismissed. We're actually going to find a court that's more sympathetic to claimants who are using vehicles with these smaller wheels and less sophisticated suspension. Product liability, I think, is a bit of something that's lurking. These vehicles, these e-scooters now, there are a lot of them about. It's not like a road or motorcycle where there is a manufacturer dealer network or established network for repairing or maintaining them. What's a proper inspection or service regime for them? What's the minimum standards for the e-scooters? The e-scooters themselves could be defective. There could be retailers or workshops that offer replacement parts, so a retailer for doing it yourself or a workshop providing a service to do it, or even modifications, not just ones to make them go more quickly. Are those adequate? Are they safe? I suspect that given the nature of the shops that have sprung up providing aftermarket service, I suspect that some of them don't have adequate product liability insurance in place. They may have insurance in respect of public liability, but they're not properly covered in respect of products liability. So I think with a number of the scooters on the road and the number of people buying them secondhand, changing the parts on them, there's likely to be claims that spring from the repair and modification of them. So I hope this talk from both of us provides some reassurance or at least some guidance in this uncertain and rapidly developing area. I don't know if James has marshalled any questions to answer, but thank you for your time nevertheless.
Thanks, James. Yeah, there were 4 questions. I wasn't ignoring you. I was typing away, answering some of those questions. I think I've probably covered them all. I mean, interesting. What the final question actually, James, was: do you think that there is an argument for contribution against parents for allowing a minor to ride an e-scooter? Which is a question just before you got to that Ellis and Kelly case. And Ellis and Kelly, probably quite a, as you say, a policy decision not to impose liability on a parent. But if a parent purchases and lets somebody out on what is a motorized vehicle, and we know how the law treats anything with an engine, they are at various degrees treated as dangerous weapons. I think that might be a different argument, as you pointed out. So I think we're probably on all fours there. There's a question about why the law makes a difference between privately owned and rented e-scooters, because safety doesn't depend on ownership. I think that's absolutely right, but that's just where we are at the moment. We're within a very pilot schemes, and it's a sort of let's look and see how things are going to pan out. So that was my view on that, and I think that the government's being cautious, is really seeing how statutory schemes go before they and regulate those, but before they then make the bigger jump out. Do we think it's likely similar provisions will apply to e-bikes? My view is no. I think e-bikes are specifically propelled manually with a bit of assistance. I mean, that's essentially what the definition is. And I think there are lots of policy reasons why there won't be over-regulation of bicycles in any way, because they're seen as a sort of light touch way of transportation, which people don't need licenses and insurance for. So I think there's probably a qualitative difference there. And the other point, someone says, sorry for asking the basics. I don't think it's basic at all. I think it's good to know, which is it illegal to ride e-scooters rented or owned on the pavement or the road? It's probably about 4 different questions there in different permutations, aren't there? So I mean, it is always illegal to ride an e-scooter on a pavement. Okay, I mean that is always illegal. Riding an e-scooter on a road, well, it won't be illegal if you've rented it from a statutory scheme and you've provided them with your full driving license. If you own it privately, well, at the moment you can't drive it. I don't think there's any way you can ride an e-scooter privately owned on the public highway. I think you'd agree with that, James, as well. So we have I think it's not a silly question, because actually there are so many, we see so many scooters being ridden on the pavement, and we see so many e-scooters which quite clearly aren't part of the statutory schemes being ridden around as well. I mean, I think that we just observe people basically in breach of the various regulations. So can e-scooters be used on cycle lanes? Well, on that, well, again, it's all subject to the statutory scheme and what that provides. I think by and large they can be, but you will find, I think each statutory scheme will have its own. So, for example, there's a statutory scheme in Milton Keynes. There's one in Southampton, and they are all different. They all have their own rules, and so you need to be kind of au fait with the detail when you sign up as to what you can and can't do. So there's probably no simple answer there. Here we have one. Scooter on a pavement, who was hit by a car at the junction when it was on the road whilst crossing. The driver did not look to his right and did not see him. Thoughts? So, well, I suppose the point is, when the scooter, well, first question, was the scooter privately owned? Was it part of a statutory scheme? Was he driving illegally? But it sounds as though the incident actually happens on the highway. So assuming that, so the issue about pavement use goes out the window, doesn't it, really? It almost, that seems to me, I suspect that will be analogous to a pedestrian crossing and being hit by a car. There might be a bit more of a duty on the e-scooter rider, because they might be traveling at greater speed. So when it comes to apportionment between the parties, there might be a slightly different dynamic at play.
Yeah, the road layouts might well be important as well. Yeah. It's difficult to know without seeing the locus and the exact circumstances of how they get on the road and are on the road when they're struck. Yeah.
But driver not looking to his right and not seeing him does suggest that the driver is going to be going down for something there. And then this I think is interesting, ex-Turpi, where there's these bash and grab muggings that happen. I think, right, as a policy decision, I don't think there's a judge in the country who won't want to find ex-Turpi made out where somebody's mugging somebody using a scooter and then suffers an injury. They will have more bite, but I think they'll have more bite for general litigation purposes and common sense approach to discouraging what is becoming really quite a worry for the police.
Yeah, my comments about ex-Turpi was about the road traffic offences, essentially things that are relating to the use of it that is illegal, rather than it being used in a crime. I'm with you. Yeah, I think if someone's clonked them over the head and nicked their handbag and ridden off at high speed, I think you're right.
Yeah. Good. Right. Well, I think we've covered all of those off now. On the assumption that there are no more questions coming through, I think that's right. Yeah, there we go. Someone else said, what about riding off at high speed? and then colliding with a car. Again, I still think that the same. I mean, I still think that you've probably got to. We're going to have a good run at making out the ex-Turpi on that, because they are engaged in the crime at the time. So I think the same dynamics apply, dependent on the car driver's level of fault. But I think by and large, I would be, if I was a defendant, I'd be very happy running that one to trial. Good. Well, thank you everyone for attending. And as I say, I think the recording, a link to the recording, and a copy of these slides will go out to you automatically. Okay. And any other queries that you do have, our details, as you will have seen, are on the start of the slide, so you can get in touch with us using those details. Okay. Otherwise, thanks very much.
Thank you.